Within less than 20 years, the whole thing was gone. In some quarters, the trolleys suffered the same fate as the trams. They were condemned as both inflexible and expensive. The Birmingham closure was of special significance. Here the trolleybuses, which had disappeared in 1951, would be outlived by the trams they had started replacing as early as 1922. Like many undertakings, the straggling company-owned Notts and Derby system had purchased new vehicles after the war, but these failed to stop total abandonment in 1953. Fortunately, the entire fleet was snapped up by Bradford, who swiftly developed a keen nose for a bargain. The Walsall manager, Edgley Cox, believed in the trolleybus. He introduced the country's first 30-foot-long two-axle vehicle in 1954. When these 70-seater sunbeams arrived, they had to be operated under a special Whitehall dispensation. In Pontypridd, the Urban District Council simply found the cost of upkeep and renewal too much. Again, all their remaining vehicles found new homes. Enthusiasts had flocked to Darlington to delight in the town's pre-war veterans, which kept going into the early 50s. The system packed up finally in 1957. In England, there were several examples of jointly operated routes. For example, vehicles from both St Helens and South Lancashire Transport worked to semi-interurban until 1956, both operators finally bowing out in 1958. St Helens managed to sell its modern trolleys, whilst all the SLT fleet, including some early 30s antiques, went for scrap. The company-owned Mexborough and Swinton system, which ran some joint routes with Rotherham, only ever ran single-deckers. In 1961, Atlanteans replaced these 35-seater centre entrance sunbeams. When acquired by Bradford, they were later fitted with new double-decker bodies. When London turned its back on the trolleybus, many provincial operators felt out in the cold and followed suit. By 1962, the whole of this once vast empire had gone, conquered by the legendary route master. For over 40 years, this has been the London bus. Famous the world over, these front-engine buses have starred in films and TV documentaries. For those in the industry, the RMs are acknowledged to be an excellent example of a vehicle designed by experts to tackle local traffic conditions. The RM is of integral construction, with the body and chassis combined in a single structure. It has an automatic gearbox and power steering. Of the 2,875 built between 1954 and 1968, the vast majority were standard length 64-seaters, while some 400 or so RMLs have 72-seater bodies and are 30-foot long. As the 64-seaters came on the market, hundreds were snapped up by other operators. These examples are still working in Reading. Today, the Route Master is the last representative of the traditional British double-decker. So catch one while you can. A look now behind closed doors. Each operator has to have a well-equipped workshop to keep its buses on the road. The wheels must keep turning smoothly to bring in the revenue. Following years of wartime neglect, things were getting back to normal by the end of the 40s. Glasgow had separate facilities for its massive fleet of trams and buses. Mechanical washers removed the need to wash each vehicle by hand. Any prospective driver with London transport had to face up to the skid patch at Chiswick. The recruits climbed in the cab, drove flat out onto a wet surface, slammed on the brakes, and then tried to control the bus as it went into a skid. All good fun when watched from a distance. Here, an STL class was being used in 1952. When Sunderland replaced its trams in October 1954, the opportunity was taken to make a film about the corporation's transport department. Included was this footage shot at Fulwell Depot. Here a bus receives an overhauled engine. Whilst another undergoes a major body overhaul. At Wallasey, views of a chassis being steam cleaned, seats retrimmed, being repainted, and running in at the end of the day. Like many other facilities, this one was demolished in the 1980s. Where does an old bus go to die? Some escape into preservation, but the vast majority end up in scrapyards. These twisted remains were filmed in a graveyard at Stratford-upon-Avon. Too worn out to find new owners, the majority of London trolleybuses were stripped of any valuable parts before the gaunt skeletons were broken up at Colindale. The trolleybus really died during the 60s. Everywhere it was buses in, trolleybuses out. In 1963, 3 more municipalities, including Portsmouth, switched off the power. These are just a handful of the towns and cities where trolleybuses were sacrificed during this electrical purge. Why did the end come so swiftly? Despite buying new vehicles in 1954, Hull stated passenger traffic had declined and new housing estates extended beyond the existing trolleybus wiring. In Nottingham, where they ran from 1927 to 1966, their demise was hastened by central area redevelopment. The last new vehicles dated from 1952. Newcastle also cited central area redevelopment, together with lack of mobility and high operational costs. Operations here had started in 1935. New vehicles were delivered up to 1950, an extension opened in 1956, but the end came just 10 years later. In Belfast, the trolleys had started replacing the trams in 1938. 20 years later, the first route was closed. By 1968, it was all over. At Huddersfield, the trolleys were very much at home, soaring effortlessly up spectacular grades. However, power costs and redevelopment led to final abandonment in July 1968. The very last trolleybuses bowed out in Bradford in March 1972. No one was building new vehicles, and the second-hand market had dried up. So the end was inevitable. Although rear-engine bus designs have dominated the past 40 years, front-engine buses were still built to the end of the 60s. These included Leyland PD2s and Bristol low-deckers, of which over 5,000 were built up to 1968. Bristol also marketed the most successful of the first generation of rear-engine single-deckers. The RE was marketed from 1962 to 1984, although those built after 1976 were solely for export. The formation from the end of the 60s of the giant passenger transport executives spelt the end for many municipal operators. A flashback to 1957, when a rich kaleidoscope of municipal colours dominated central Manchester. The 60s to the 80s would be an era of takeovers and consolidations of manufacturers, during which many famous names disappeared. Crosley, AC, Guy, Daimler, Bristol, Park Royal, to name but a few. So, what of today? Has deregulation introduced in October 1986 been successful? Certainly the industry is more profitable and leaner. It is also clearer where local authority subsidies are going. However, for the public, the overall level of service has undoubtedly declined. Now the big three, Stagecoach, Arriva and First Group, have to steer the slimmed-down industry into the 21st century. But here is the dilemma. They must also halt the decline in passenger numbers as car ownership continues to rise. As 2000 beckons, Britain's new buses are Dennis's, Volvos, DAFs, Scanias and Mercedes. Although the double-decker has survived, many of the greatest names, once the powerhouses of the British bus industry, have gone forever. Daimler, Tilling-Stevens, Burlingham, Bristol, ECW, Guy, Park Royal, Wayman, Albion, Dupel, English Electric, Crosley, Bedford, Thornycroft and MCW. Fortunately, a remarkable 5,000 old buses and trolleybuses survive through the efforts of the preservation movement. These magnificent machines of all shapes and sizes keep alive the sights and the sounds of a century of British buses and trolleybuses.